A. 6-1 Britain's law and order strategy and its consequences. If you asked many colonists in 1774 what they wanted, a lot of them would not have said, a new country. They wanted to stop what felt like a dangerous shift in British politics, who held power, whose rights counted, and who set the rules of daily life. Revolutions rarely begin with a unified cry for independence. More often, they start with people who still think the relationship can be repaired, and then watch the other side respond in ways that make repair feel impossible. In the American case, Britain increasingly treated resistance as a law enforcement problem to suppress, not a political dispute to negotiate. That choice didn't restore order. It reshaped identities, changed minds, turned politics into war, and eventually into a formal legal break in 1776, on the eve of revolution. When historians describe Britain's law and order approach in the mid-1770s, they mean a specific governing mindset. Colonial protest was being read less as negotiation within the empire and more as rebellion against legitimate authority. If it's rebellion, the answer isn't compromise, it's punishment and enforcement. Close the port, restrict self-government, increase troops, and insist Parliament can legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The logic was straightforward and, in Britain's view, necessary. If the government backed down in America, it worried that defiance would spread, not just across the colonies, but throughout the empire. That pressure didn't produce one single colonial response. Instead, it sharpened an existing divide. Patriots, often called Whigs, increasingly framed resistance as the defense of rights and self-government. Many of them still wanted greater autonomy within the empire, while a smaller number were already thinking toward independence. Loyalists, often called Tories, did not necessarily approve of every parliamentary policy, but they prioritized stability and the imperial connection. Some feared that escalating protest would unravel social order crowds targeting elites, debts repudiated, and property made insecure. Others believed Britain's mixed constitution, balancing king and parliament, offered the best long-term protection for liberty, and that the colonies were safer inside the most powerful Atlantic empire. This wasn't simply pro-freedom versus anti-freedom. It was competing fears. Patriots feared arbitrary power. Loyalists feared chaos and disintegration. As imperial pressure rose, colonists also built the infrastructure for coordinated resistance. 13 colonies with different economies and histories don't automatically cooperate. Cooperation has to be constructed. Committees of correspondence acted like a political nervous system, spreading news and aligning responses so Boston didn't stand alone. Militias, including Massachusetts Minutemen, grew out of long community defense traditions, now redirected toward a political crisis. Colonial assemblies became arenas for claiming legitimacy against royal governors. When issues exceeded any one colony, delegates met in congresses, especially the Continental Congress, to coordinate boycotts, petitions, and eventually military planning. Britain's attempt to impose order had an unintended effect. It pushed colonists to practice self-government in real time, building habits of cooperation that later made separation more feasible. That organization rested on ideas moving quickly through colonial society. No taxation without representation, condensed a constitutional claim. Many colonists argued Parliament could not tax them because they elected no members to Parliament. Britain replied with virtual representation, insisting that members of Parliament represented all British subjects, not only their local voters. That might have sounded workable in theory, but it felt very different when taxes, courts, and soldiers shaped daily life and colonists had no realistic political leverage to change them. Alongside these arguments spread Enlightenment natural rights language. Rights belong to people because they are human, not because government grants them. Under both was a growing fear of absolute monarch, power. Not that George III literally ruled as a dictator in the technical sense, but that the empire seemed to be drifting toward arbitrary rule without meaningful consent. That phrase would echo later in the case for independence because it captured a deep anxiety that normal restraints on power were failing. It's also important to correct a common misconception. By 1774 or early 1775, most colonists were not yet trying to leave the empire. Many still wanted reconciliation. They protested as defenders of the rights of Englishmen and assumed Britain would retreat once it grasped the depth of colonial opposition. Early resistance was often conservative in intent, restore what colonists believed the British Constitution promised. The turning point was Britain's decision to treat protest as disobedience to crush. Once each side interprets the other in the least charitable terms, they're plotting rebellion, they're building tyranny. Violence becomes easier to imagine. From the colonial perspective, it looked like military coercion, disarm communities, and intimidate them into submission. The warning rides associated with Paul Revere and William Dawes matter because they reveal preparation and coordination. They weren't delivering drama into silence. They activated an existing network that expected troop movement. When shots were fired at Lexington and fighting spread at Concord and along the road back to Boston, the meaning of the conflict changed immediately. This was no longer petitions and pamphlets. It was bloodshed between British regulars and colonial militia. Lexington and Concord mattered less for their size than for their psychological and political impact. Once people kill and are killed, compromise becomes harder to sell. The phrase, "shot heard around the world," points to a wider reality. Imperial rivals watched closely. If British colonies could fight the mother country, other imperial systems might face similar challenges. In an Atlantic world of competing empires, a colonial rebellion was never merely local. In June 1775 came Bunker Hill. The name is misleading. Much fighting occurred on Breed's Hill, but the message was clear. The British ultimately took the position, so they gained ground, yet they paid a shocking casualty cost for an army accustomed to defeating irregular forces. For Americans, it was grim encouragement. Colonial fighters could stand against professionals when organized and determined. At the same time, Bunker Hill exposed limits. Courage doesn't substitute for supplies, discipline, and coordination. Those limits help clarify a key distinction: militia versus army. Minutemen and local militias were community-based and rapid response, hence MINUT, designed for local defense. They were built for sustained, coordinated campaigns across multiple colonies. As the conflict widened, a unified force became necessary, which led to the creation of the Continental Army. That military decision also signaled political change. Building a Continental Army wasn't only strategy, it was an early act of forging a shared cause beyond any single colony. Once violence began, escalation fed itself. Each clash reduced space for reconciliation because it raised the stakes. Britain read resistance as proof that more force was needed. Patriots read British force as proof that liberty could not be secure under imperial rule. Even people who preferred compromise were pushed to choose when war reached their towns and farms. Violence compresses complex debates into an urgent question: whose authority will govern here? Common sense. By early 1776, fighting was underway, yet many colonists were still not fully committed to independence. Thomas Paine's common sense arrived at exactly the moment when the political meaning of the war was still unsettled. Paine wrote in direct language for ordinary readers, not in elite, legalistic style, more like a plain-spoken argument you might hear in a tavern or meeting house. Paine attacked monarchy itself. He rejected the comforting idea that George III was a good king, misled by bad ministers, arguing instead that monarchy was inherently illegitimate and tended toward tyranny. He cast the king as an absolute monarch figure, not as a precise description of Britain's system, but as a warning about unchecked power. He also made a practical geographic argument. It made little sense for a distant island to rule a vast continent. The issue wasn't just distance, it was responsiveness. Decisions made across the Atlantic by people who would never live with the consequences looked like bad government. From there, Paine offered a positive alternative, a republican government grounded in the people rather than inherited kingship. He shifted the question from how do we protect our rights within the empire to why remain tied to this empire at all? That reframing mattered. Debating rights within the empire leaves room for compromise. Claiming monarchy is corrupt, and the connection irrational makes compromise feel like surrender. Common sense spread widely, read aloud, passed hand to hand, and debated in public. Without electronic media, that kind of circulation is how public opinion moved. Paine gave colonists shared vocabulary and accessible reasons that didn't require legal training. That helped ordinary people see independence as logical rather than reckless, and it gave delegates political cover. If you were going to vote to sever ties with the most powerful Atlantic empire, you needed to believe the public would see it as principle, not betrayal. It's also worth keeping the timing straight. Common sense did not start the revolution militarily. When it appeared, shots had been fired, people had died, and an army was forming. Its impact was political. It accelerated acceptance of independence and helped turn a war of resistance into a war for a new nation. The Declaration of Independence. With public opinion shifting, the path to the Declaration becomes clearer. Independence wasn't a sudden July 4 epiphany. It was legislative and deliberate. On June 7, 1770, Richard Henry Lee introduced a resolution that the colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. That line matters because it asserts legal status, not merely complaint. After debate and maneuvering, Congress adopted Lee's resolution on July 2, 1776, often overlooked because the holiday is July 4. But July 2nd is when independence was voted in principle. July 4 matters because Congress approved the final text of the Declaration of Independence, the public justification of what it had already decided. The drafting process also underscores that this was collective, not one person's inspiration. A committee drafted it. Thomas Jefferson was the primary writer whose language shaped the final text, but Congress edited and debated it to present a united front. The Declaration addressed two audiences. At home, it aimed to persuade colonists, especially the uncertain middle, that independence was a reasoned conclusion, not an outburst. Abroad, it served as diplomacy. To gain foreign support, especially from rivals like France, the colonies had to appear as legitimate political actors with a coherent argument, not as rioters. International recognition tends to follow causes that look organized, principled, and durable. Its structure matches that purpose. It begins with general principles about government and rights to explain why people may change governments. It then lays out a detailed list of grievances to show a pattern of abuses connected to George III's government. Finally, it announces independence and the powers of sovereignty, waging war, making peace, forming alliances. It doesn't just say, "We're angry." It argues political philosophy, offers evidence, and reaches a legal conclusion. The most famous lines come from the principles section. All men are created equal and possess unalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is Enlightenment natural rights language applied to politics. Rights exist prior to government, and legitimate government is created to secure them. Those phrases echo through later history because they become a measuring stick. Once legitimacy is grounded in equal rights, people will ask whether the nation is meeting its own standard. At the same time, serious readers have to face the tension between ideals and reality. The Declaration's language was expansive, but the society that produced it included slavery, narrow political participation, and deep inequality. Some contemporaries recognized the contradiction immediately. Abigail Adams, for example, urged her husband John Adams and other leaders to apply revolutionary principles more broadly, warning against fighting for liberty while keeping others unfree. The honest view isn't that these problems were solved in 1776, but that the revolution articulated ideals that were both inspiring and incomplete, and people could see the gap at the time. By the Declaration's adoption, Britain's law and order strategy had produced the opposite of its goal. Rather than isolating radicals and restoring loyalty, escalation strengthened colonial institutions, pushed moderates toward the patriot cause, and linked events, from Lexington and Concord to common sense, to Congress's vote, until independence seemed less like a distant possibility and more like the only coherent endpoint to a conflict already in motion. Once a people claim the authority to declare independence, the question stops being whether they are still British subjects and becomes whether they can win the war that claim requires. B62, the early years of the Revolution, the British strategy. In the middle colonies, once fighting spread beyond New England, British leaders approached the war like an empire, controlled the oceans, commerce, and key communication routes. The middle colonies were the rebellion's geographic hinge. If Britain could anchor itself there, the colonies would feel less like one coordinated resistance and more like isolated regions unable to support each other. The plan was direct. Britain aimed to seize major port cities, especially New York, tighten control over trade and supplies, and use those ports as bases to move armies along the coast and major rivers. The imperial premise was simple. Control the economic arteries and political nerve centers, and resistance will collapse. New York City was the centerpiece. It wasn't just another colonial town. It had a deep-water harbor that could host and supply the Royal Navy, one of the most powerful military tools on Earth at the time. From New York, British commanders could strike toward New England, up the Hudson River corridor, and into New Jersey and Pennsylvania. Its position made it seem like a lever take it, and the rebellion splits. Once Britain captured and held New York, it gained a durable base that Americans struggled to threaten, and that mattered day by day because wars are won through sustained movement of men, food, gunpowder, and information, not only through single battles. Occupation also hit the economy hard. When Britain held key ports, Patriot-controlled commerce didn't merely slow, it nearly collapsed. Historians often cite a trade decline of about 95%, and the practical effects were immediate. Farm families might have food, but lack salt to preserve it. Militia units might have muskets, but no flints, and merchants watched ships idle or get intercepted. Scarcity drove prices up, and inflation turned routine purchasing into constant improvisation. Since the Continental Army depended on states and local communities for food and clothing, blocked ports and disrupted trade translated into thin rations, missing uniforms, barefoot soldiers, and recurring political fights over who owed supplies and money. Britain's edge wasn't only naval. It fielded professional regulars trained for discipline, coordinated maneuvers, and long campaigns. Britain also hired German auxiliaries, commonly called Hessians, who became a symbol in patriot rhetoric of imperial overreach. Their presence reinforced the belief that Britain was treating its own subjects with foreign brutality by importing outsiders to suppress them. That perception mattered because revolutions run on political will as much as gunpowder. Stories of cruelty or overreach can harden support even when battlefield news is discouraging. Yet embedded in Britain's strategy was a trap. Taking cities didn't automatically end resistance. The revolution wasn't stored in ports like cargo in a warehouse. Patriot governments could operate outside occupied zones, committees could still gather supplies, and militias could make the countryside dangerous even if a British flag flew over a harbor. Britain assumed holding obvious centers would break the rebellion, but it underestimated the revolution's networks, local governance, community enforcement, and a shared commitment that independence was worth suffering for. Britain could occupy New York and later Philadelphia and still face the harder question: how do you force millions spread over vast territory to stop resisting when many can retreat inland and keep the war going? George Washington and the Continental Army. That reality helps explain why Washington's job was brutal from the beginning. In 1775, he took command of an army that existed more in intent than readiness. The soldiers had courage, but courage isn't training, and enthusiasm isn't a supply system. Washington faced the world's strongest empire while routinely short of powder, tents, and shoes, and dangerously short of time, since enlistments were brief and the pull to return home was constant. He wasn't only trying to win battles, he was trying to keep the army from dissolving between them. The 1776 campaign around New York showed the danger in the clearest way. The British didn't simply defeat Washington, they nearly destroyed him. With naval control of waterways and coordinated attacks by professional troops, Britain repeatedly outmaneuvered the Continentals. Key moments ended in routs, and the overall campaign bordered on catastrophe. The central lesson wasn't just the Americans lost, but why? Britain could concentrate overwhelming force at a chosen place and time. If Washington fought on Britain's terms, he risked losing the one thing the revolution could not afford to lose, its main army. In that situation, survival and escape could matter as much as victory because the army's existence was political proof that the rebellion still had a backbone. This also reshapes what victory meant early on. It's easy to imagine victory as taking a capital or winning one decisive battle. For the Americans, victory often meant something less dramatic but more realistic: avoid annihilation, preserve the army, and keep the cause alive long enough that Britain's costs, money, domestic political support, and the burden of sustaining a distant war became intolerable. Washington wanted battlefield success, but he couldn't trade the army for one heroic stand. In modern terms, he was protecting the revolution's operating system. Without it, no later win would matter. Keeping that army intact required relentless administration. Washington wrote constantly, about 947 letters from July 1775 to early 1707, because the war was also a massive coordination problem. He negotiated with governors, pressed legislators, argued with supply officers, managed rival generals, and kept Congress informed while trying to anticipate British moves. Those letters weren't bureaucratic noise, they were leadership. With no strong national government, reliable taxation, or professional bureaucracy, communication became the glue. A shortage of blankets was logistical, but it quickly became political when soldiers threatened to leave, and strategic when an army couldn't be fielded. Washington's correspondence helped stitch those layers together. By the winter of 1717-88, the stitching was failing, and Valley Forge concentrated the war's hardship into one image. After Britain captured Philadelphia, Washington's army went into winter quarters and faced severe deprivation, food shortages, inadequate clothing, disease, and the demoralization of losing a major city. Valley Forge became symbolic not because it was the only suffering, but because it captures a core truth of the early war. Britain often supplied itself better, and the Americans had to survive long enough to become more than a desperate rebellion. Resilience mattered, but the moment also showed that endurance alone isn't a plan. Washington needed both survival and a strategy to end the suffering. Philadelphia and Saratoga, British and American victories. Philadelphia's capture shows how military events carried political meaning. Philadelphia was not merely large, it was the revolution's political heart, tied to the Continental Congress and the idea of organized independence. When Britain took it, it scored a major morale and propaganda victory. To many observers it looked like proof the rebellion was collapsing. If Britain could occupy the revolutionary government's seat, wasn't the war effectively over? For civilians and soldiers already strained by shortages, Philadelphia's fall intensified the fear that Britain's advantages, money, training, navy, and professional command, might finally be decisive. Yet Philadelphia did not end the revolution, and the reason reveals the kind of war this was. Congress could relocate, and it did. Patriot institutions weren't tied to one building. The contest wasn't only for cities, but for legitimacy and everyday loyalty. Britain could hold an urban center, but unless it could extend stable authority into the countryside, collect taxes, enforce laws, protect loyalists, and intimidate or persuade patriots, occupation could even backfire by forcing more immediate choices of allegiance. Philadelphia was a symbol and a setback, not a checkmate. Saratoga in 1777 illustrates the opposite, how a battlefield victory could change the war's international reality. The fighting ended in a major American success, including the surrender of a British force. Saratoga mattered because it provided proof that pamphlets and speeches could not. The Americans could win a significant conventional victory against British troops. Before Saratoga, foreign powers could admire American ideals while assuming Britain would eventually crush the rebellion. Saratoga forced a recalculation. If Americans could defeat and capture a British army in the field, supporting them no longer looked like a romantic gamble, it looked like a practical way to weaken Britain. That's why Saratoga connects directly to diplomacy. International credibility depends on evidence, and wartime evidence is battlefield performance. Saratoga signaled staying power and competence, not just passion. It helped create conditions for greater foreign involvement, especially from France, because Britain's rivals wanted to reduce British power but needed a partner with a real chance of success. Saratoga shifted not only momentum in North America, but also the balance of risk in European decision-making. The revolution began to look like a conflict Britain could lose, and that perception itself functioned as a weapon. It's important not to overstate it, though. Saratoga was a turning point, not a finish line. It changed what was possible. It boosted American confidence, weakened the sense of British invincibility, and made foreign aid more likely by demonstrating competence and endurance. Britain still held major cities. The Continental Army still struggled with supplies, and the fighting remained intense and complex. A turning point is when the race becomes a different race, not when it stops. By late 1777 into 1778, the revolution balanced two truths. Britain's middle colony strategy inflicted real damage, occupied ports, economic collapse, and military setbacks that nearly. Yet Washington's insistence on keeping the army alive, combined with the shock of Saratoga, meant the rebellion survived and became more credible to potential allies. Hardship that didn't kill the cause, and victory that made the cause believable, set up the next phase. When the war expands beyond the Atlantic seaboard, and independence starts to look like an international contest rather than a strictly colonial rebellion. See 6.3, War in the South Georgia and South Carolina. As the war continued, British leaders faced a stubborn reality. Capturing major cities didn't end the rebellion. They could take New York or Philadelphia, raise the flag, and still see the Continental Army evade destruction while patriot governments operated beyond occupied zones. That frustration helps explain Britain's pivot southward, where officials believed the war could be fought and won on different terms. The British Southern strategy rested on assumptions that looked plausible from London. Officials expected stronger loyalist support in Georgia and the Carolinas than in New England or much of the mid-Atlantic. Southern ports also mattered economically and strategically. Savannah and Charleston anchored Atlantic trade and served as gateways for supplies and communication. British planners imagined they could restore authority region by region, seize a port, push inland, recruit loyalists, re-establish civil government, and repeat. The weakness in that plan was that occupation isn't just geography, it's persuasion. Control requires convincing people that British rule is permanent and resistance is futile. In the South, taking cities proved easier than securing allegiance. Once British forces moved into Georgia and South Carolina, the war developed a pattern that can be missed if we focus only on major battles. Control constantly shifted. The British might hold a town or coastal strip while patriot militia dominated nearby countryside, and then the balance would flip again. For civilians, who rules could change in weeks, even days. Picture a farmer outside Charleston in 1780. 1 month you're pressured to swear loyalty to the king to protect your property. The next, patriots return and treat that oath as treason. In that environment, choices were often less about ideology than survival under fear and uncertainty. That instability is why the Southern War often felt like a civil war layered onto an imperial war. Patriots and loyalists fought not only in formal armies but also as neighbors through raids, reprisals, and escalating retaliation. Violence existed in the North, too, but the Southern backcountry became notorious for how quickly conflict turned personal and local. When historians describe Civil War-like violence, they mean the collapse of distance between battlefield and home. Barns, churches, and court days became targets. Violence didn't always arrive as a neat line of redcoats. It might come as a loyalist militia at night or a patriot band seeking vengeance, each claiming to restore justice. Strategically, this made British control expensive and fragile. Holding territory required more than winning a single decisive fight. It meant securing roads, rivers, supply depots, and scattered communities across vast spaces. Patriot resistance often took forms that conventional armies struggled to suppress. Guerrilla tactics like ambushes, hit-and-run attacks, sabotage, and raids on outposts. If Britain spread troops thin to garrison every vulnerable point, it weakened itself. If it concentrated forces in strongholds, it effectively conceded much of the countryside. Either way, the patriot cause could persist, and for a rebellion, persistence can be enough. It doesn't have to win everywhere, it has to avoid being extinguished. This Southern theater also forced urgent choices on enslaved people, and that cannot be treated as a side note because it shaped lives inside the military story. Wartime disruption sometimes opened possibilities, though possibility could mean danger as much as hope. Some enslaved people fled as armies approached, using chaos as cover. Others tried to bargain for protection, wages, or freedom in exchange for labor or information. Many were also forcibly moved as enslavers relocated to avoid armies, or as troops confiscated supplies and treated human beings as movable property. British signals, at different moments and in different forms, that enslaved people who fled patriot masters and aided Britain might gain freedom carried enormous weight. Even when policy was inconsistent and often brutal in practice, the promise itself created a powerful pull. In the South, who controls the area could also mean which direction offers a chance, however uncertain, to escape slavery. At the same time, the Southern War expanded and intensified tensions between colonists and native nations. The conflict was not unfolding on empty land. Indigenous communities had their own politics, rivalries, and stakes in the outcome. As fighting shifted south, alliances could shift, and frontier violence could spiral through raids, retaliation, and opportunism. For many native nations, the revolution was less about representation in parliament than about land, sovereignty, and whether colonial settlement would surge westward. British officials had sometimes promised limits on expansion, while many patriots imagined independence as opening the door to growth. Those pressures pulled native communities into the conflict, turning the southern theater into overlapping wars, with different groups fighting for different futures. Taken together, these dynamics showed the consequences of Britain's southern turn. The South did not produce a clean loyalist uprising that restored British authority from within. Instead, the war stretched into a prolonged, vicious struggle that drained resources and deepened polarization. It's one thing to fight an enemy army. It's another to fight amid fractured communities where opponents are seen as traitors. Occupying a few cities rarely settles that kind of war, and brutality could harden resistance by making reconciliation feel impossible. All of that sets up the war's final movement, how military stalemate and strategic failure translated into diplomacy that made independence real in the eyes of the world. The Treaty of Paris. The endpoint is the Treaty of Paris, 1783, which formally ended the American War of Independence and recognized the United States as an independent nation. Recognition can sound like paperwork compared to battles, but in international politics, paperwork is power. Armies can win territory, yet without a settlement, the legal status of the conflict remains unresolved. You can have de facto self-rule without de jure independence recognized in the system of nations. A peace treaty does several jobs at once. It converts battlefield outcomes into legal recognition, giving other states a clear basis to treat the United States as sovereign rather than a rebellion. It sets terms to end fighting, defines territorial arrangements, and establishes expectations for post-war behavior. Without that framework, violence can sputter on and uncertainty becomes instability. The treaty is where war's messy facts become enforceable claims. That's why the Treaty of Paris marks a final break. In a way the Declaration of Independence did not, even though the Declaration mattered profoundly as a statement of principle and purpose. In 1776, independence was asserted. In 1783, it was acknowledged by the empire fighting to prevent it, and that acknowledgement changed the conflict's meaning internationally. It's the difference between declaring "I'm leaving" and the institution signing a document releasing its claims. The first defines intent. The second makes separation stick for everyone else. The treaty also reflects shifting momentum. It didn't appear out of nowhere. Early in the war, Americans faced major hardships, limited training, supplies, money, and sometimes unity, and Britain had reasons to think the rebellion might collapse. Turning points then reshaped diplomacy, especially Saratoga, which helped persuade France to back the American cause. Once France entered, the war became international. Britain faced not just 13 colonies, but European rivals with navies and global interests, and the longer it dragged on, the more Britain had to ask whether reconquering the colonies was worth the escalating cost. By the early 1780s, negotiation wasn't simply a matter of pride. It reflected a hard reality. British military success often failed to produce stable political control. Even when Britain held ports or won battles, it struggled to translate those gains into durable authority. Meanwhile, the Americans achieved something crucial in many independence movements. They survived long enough to become a political fact. Keeping an army in the field, civilian governments functioning, and alliances intact could outlast a stronger opponent that lacked a workable endgame. This is also where another misconception needs correction. It's tempting to treat the Declaration of Independence as if it created the United States instantly in 1776. But independence wasn't secured by declaring it alone. It had to be defended through years of military endurance and political persistence, then finalized through diplomacy. The Declaration argued why independence was justified. The war tested whether that claim could survive. The Treaty of Paris determined whether it would be accepted as law by other powers. Remove any step, and the story stops making sense. So 1783 doesn't replace 1776, it completes it. The Declaration's ideals gained historical weight because the United States endured the trial that followed, and completion immediately raised new problems no longer solved by fighting Britain. A society that fought for liberty now had to decide what liberty meant for people within its borders, including enslaved African Americans and native nations who experienced the revolution in sharply different ways. The war's end didn't close those questions. It made them unavoidable. D. 6.4. Identity during the American Revolution. Enslaved people and native people. When we talk about identity during the American Revolution, it's easy to imagine a clean split, patriots versus loyalists, as if people simply chose sides in 1776 based on political theory. But the revolution didn't arrive like a classroom debate. It arrived as war, armies moving through farms and towns, trade disrupted, families displaced, and local authority thrown into chaos. For enslaved people and native peoples, the conflict opened dangerous possibilities while also shrinking the space for safety. Their decisions were usually less about which pamphlets sounded inspiring and more about which choice might produce freedom, security, or sovereignty when the usual rules were breaking down. Even within the patriot world, some people who believed deeply in liberty recognized the contradiction. Abigail Adams wished most sincerely there was not a slave in the province, and she put the issue bluntly: how could colonists claim they were being robbed of liberty while they were daily robbing enslaved people? That critique wasn't invented later. People in the era could see, say, and feel the tension. Revolutionary language about natural rights and human equality rose dramatically, while many people's lived reality remained coercion, forced labor, and dispossession. For enslaved people, that contradiction wasn't abstract, it was daily life. What the war changed was the machinery that made slavery function. Enslavement relied on surveillance, stable property claims, working courts, and an enslaver's ability to summon local authorities. War strained all of it. When men left for militias or the Continental Army, farms and plantations could become harder to control. When British forces occupied towns or raided coasts, authority blurred. When roads filled with refugees and soldiers, movement could be concealed. The revolution created openings for agency, not because the war aimed to free enslaved people, but because conflict weakened systems that enforce captivity. Agency did not mean safety or unlimited options. The risks were extreme. Escape could bring pursuit, punishment, sale away from family, or death. Military service could mean disease, brutal conditions, and disposability. Still, the war created practical chances at a scale that hadn't existed before. Some enslaved people fled behind British lines because British proclamations and practices, especially early on, sometimes promised freedom to those who left patriot enslavers and supported the crown. For someone enslaved in Virginia or South Carolina, this wasn't philosophy. It was a direct calculation that reaching British forces might mean no longer being treated as property. At the same time, it would be misleading to flatten this into enslaved people supported Britain. Many pursued freedom by whatever route was most workable. Some negotiated with patriot enslavers for manumission in exchange for military service. Others served as substitutes for white men drafted into militia duty, trying to turn a crisis into a permanent change in status. Some took independence simply by leaving, disappearing into cities, frontier regions, or maroon communities without formally joining either side. The common thread is strategic use of disruption, an army camp needing labor, a port city offering anonymity, a chaotic evacuation where someone could slip onto a ship, or a weakened patrol system. Revolutionary liberty rhetoric could matter, especially when it highlighted patriot hypocrisy, but decisions often came down to what might work right now, in a specific place, under whoever held power. Geography shaped outcomes. In the North, where slavery existed but on a smaller scale than in the plantation South, some enslaved people gained freedom through service and through gradual abolition laws that followed the Revolution. In the South, slavery was central to the economy, giving white leaders strong incentives to defend it. The war often intensified fears of rebellion and escape. That's part of the Revolution's lived contradiction. The same conflict that amplified claims about universal rights also hardened some Americans' commitment to slavery. So when we say the war created both opportunities and risks, we mean openings for movement and negotiation emerged inside a violent struggle where people could be recaptured, exploited by whichever army was present, or abandoned as the war shifted elsewhere. If we widen the lens to native peoples, the pattern is similar in one key way and different in another. It's similar because native nations also made strategic choices under intense pressure based on which power threatened them most. It's different because the central issue was not individual emancipation from a legal status, but collective sovereignty, control of land, political independence, and community survival. To understand why many native peoples supported Britain, you have to look beyond Lexington and Concord. Westward colonial settlement had been advancing for generations, and after the 7 Years' War ended in 1763, France no longer balanced British and colonial power in North America. For many native nations, the most urgent threat wasn't tea taxes in Boston. It was colonial encroachment surveyors marking fields, settlers cutting roads, and militia violence on the frontier. Even when Britain promised limits on settlement beyond certain lines, colonists often resented those limits and crossed them anyway. When war erupted, many native leaders asked a practical question: which side is more likely to restrain settler expansion enough to protect our homelands? In that context, Britain could seem, if not benevolent, then strategically useful. British officials had self-interested reasons to curb uncontrolled Western settlement because it could trigger costly frontier wars and disrupt trade. Limiting expansion could preserve stability. Colonists, by contrast, had strong incentives to push west. Land hunger wasn't merely individual ambition, it was embedded in colonial politics and the economy, and many patriots viewed independence as a chance to escape British restrictions and claim the interior. From a native perspective, a patriot victory could be catastrophic. This is where confusion often arises. Supporting Britain does not mean Britain was fair. The choice wasn't between a good empire and bad rebels. It was between two expanding powers. But daily experience with frontier colonists, raids, broken agreements, sudden settlement, often made the patriot cause feel like the more immediate danger. Aligning with Britain could be a defensive strategy, preserve bargaining power, keep a military counterweight nearby, and slow settlement long enough to survive. Seen this way, the stakes become clearer. For patriots, the revolution is often taught as a fight over representation, rights, and taxation, real issues in Atlantic seaports and assemblies. For native peoples, it was also a war for the continent's interior, the Ohio Valley, the Great Lakes region, and the backcountry of the Carolinas and Georgia. Who would control these regions? Who would have authority to make treaties, and would they be enforced? In short, it was a struggle over land and sovereignty, not just a coastal rebellion over political theory. That interior war was often brutally local. It wasn't only redcoats in formation, it was frontier communities attacking villages retaliating, alliances shifting, and families driven from homes. When patriot militias attacked native towns, or native war parties struck frontier settlements, civilians were exposed and victory often meant survival through displacement. Even neutrality was difficult. Armies needed food, roads, and intelligence, and both sides pressured native communities for support. Refusing alliance could be treated as hostility and invite attack. Putting these experiences side by side sharpens historical thinking. Both enslaved people and native nations evaluated patriots and Britain in terms of power and likely outcomes, not just stated ideals. But their goals differed, so their calculations differed. An enslaved person might ask, which side increases the chances of escaping bondage, keeping family together, and avoiding recapture? A native nation might ask which side is more likely to recognize territory, treat with leaders as a sovereign people, and restrain settlers from taking land. In both cases, alignment could be less about believing a side's principles and more about leveraging war to pursue freedom, security, or sovereignty. Holding on to that comparison also helps separate two layers of the revolution that are easy to blur. One layer is the ideals, natural rights, consent of the governed, liberty from tyranny. Those ideals mattered and shaped American political culture for generations. The other layer is wartime reality, hunger, forced service, occupation, shifting control, and the immediate question of who can protect you or harm you tomorrow. Enslaved people and native peoples lived at the intersection, where lofty language might open rhetorical doors, but power on the ground determined whether you could pass through them. Keeping that distinction in mind makes the revolution look less like a single unified story and more like overlapping wars. Along the coast, patriot leaders argued about representation and independence. In enslaved quarters and workfields, people tracked news for openings to flee. In the interior, native leaders weighed settler expansion against imperial manipulation. The same cannon fire echoed across these worlds, but its meaning depended on what you stood to lose. And once the fighting ends and a new nation claims authority, those questions don't fade. They sharpen. Peace terms, new governments, and the promises Americans made about the republic had to confront what the war exposed: who counted as the people, who controlled the land, and whose freedom was treated as negotiable. Closing concepts. Why this matters. It's true that the American Revolution created a country. What made it historically disruptive wasn't only that 13 colonies broke from Britain. It was the Revolution's attempt to answer a deeper question: what makes a government legitimate? In much of the 18th century, legitimacy often looked like inheritance. Kings ruled by lineage, tradition, and the belief that authority flowed downward from God to monarch to subjects. The revolution didn't merely protest British policies, it challenged that broader logic of power. As conflict intensified, patriot language shifted toward natural rights, government as an agreement, and authority ultimately belonging to the people, not a crown. That language reframed independence. Separation wasn't presented only as a practical response to an empire that taxed too much or stationed troops in Boston. It became a moral claim. People have rights before government exists, and governments are legitimate only when they protect those rights and rest on popular sovereignty authority from the consent of the governed. That was radical because it made loyalty conditional. If a government becomes destructive of rights, citizens are justified in withdrawing obedience. In a world built on inherited hierarchy, conditional legitimacy is a dangerous idea. The revolution also exposed contradictions that independence did not erase. The most painful was slavery. Patriots spoke of liberty in universal terms, and some meant it, yet the war unfolded in a society where hundreds of thousands lived in inherited bondage, and many leaders who spoke the language of natural rights held people as property. A second tension ran alongside slavery: expansion. Colonists wanted Western land, but native nations already lived there with their own governments, alliances, and territorial claims. Revolutionary language could condemn empire, yet the new United States would soon face the temptation to behave like one, expanding, claiming territory, and displacing indigenous peoples. Seen this way, learning turning points and diplomatic endings is not just memorizing battles. Revolutions don't succeed on passion alone. They succeed when ideas survive hardship, when strategy turns survival into momentum, and when legitimacy is recognized not only by supporters at home, but by powerful outsiders abroad. A revolution must last long enough and look credible enough that people risk lives and fortunes on it, and other nations decide support is worth the cost. The American Revolution is, in that sense, a case study in endurance, in freezing camps through political division, and in persuading skeptical allies that a real nation is emerging. Key takeaways. If you try to name the exact moment the colonies became independent, July 4, 1076 is the obvious answer. But independence didn't arrive like a light switch. It emerged gradually as conflict narrowed the possibility of reconciliation. Early on, many colonists condemned Parliament while still seeing themselves as loyal British subjects, defending what they viewed as traditional rights. Even after fighting began, efforts like the Olive Branch Petition tried to preserve ties to the king. Each confrontation, Lexington and Concord, Bunker Hill, the widening war and British occupation, made repairing the empire harder to defend. War forces clarity. Once blood is shed and cities are occupied, the question shifts from who's right to who will have power over us tomorrow. Into that tightening crisis came Thomas Paine's common sense. Its influence came from translation and persuasion, not from revealing brand new facts. Paine took a complicated imperial dispute and turned it into direct, emotionally compelling logic that ordinary readers could argue about in taverns and workshops. He attacked monarchy as a system, not just George III as a person, and treated independence as the obvious conclusion rather than a terrifying leap. It became one of the clearest early examples of mass political persuasion in America, using print to move people from frustration toward a new identity. The Declaration of Independence followed, often remembered as pure inspiration but actually doing two jobs at once. It makes universal claims about legitimacy, grounding government in natural rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and insisting governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. Because those claims were written in universal terms, later movements for abolition, women's rights, and civil rights could cite them as a standard the nation ought to meet. At the same time, the Declaration works like an international legal brief, listing grievances against the king to justify separation. It aimed not only to rally patriots, but also to persuade foreign powers the colonies had a serious case and deserved recognition. That language coexisted with a brutal early war reality. The Continental Army faced chronic shortages: food, clothing, weapons, dependable pay, along with disease, hard winters, and the constant danger that enlistments would expire and the army would dissolve. Valley Forge matters because it represents the pattern, not instant triumph, but survival under conditions that could have ended the rebellion through exhaustion. and in real time, hardship wasn't automatically noble. It was politically dangerous. If civilians lost confidence, if soldiers deserted, or if leaders turned on one another, the revolution could collapse without a decisive battlefield defeat. Endurance wasn't sentimental. It was a key reason independence remained possible. In that long struggle, Saratoga, 1777, stands out not only because Americans won, but because it changed what foreign governments believed. Before Saratoga, France could sympathize yet doubt the rebels would last. After Saratoga, the rebellion looked like a credible war for independence. That shift mattered because revolutions need resources, and France could offer money, supplies, naval power, and trained officers, aid that also forced Britain to spread its forces globally. Here, military events and diplomacy lock together. A battlefield win becomes a diplomatic argument, and an alliance reshapes the next campaign. French involvement helped transform the conflict from a colonial rebellion into part of a wider imperial contest. The war's end also shows that winning and finishing aren't the same. Even after major British defeats, independence still had to be secured in a form other nations accepted. That's why the Treaty of Paris, 1783, matters as much as Yorktown. It formally recognized U.S. independence and set boundaries that would shape future conflicts and ambitions. It also reminds us that wars end through negotiation, and negotiation reflects power. Franklin, Adams, and Jay were not merely recording victory, they were bargaining in a world where allies had agendas. The revolution's ending wasn't a clean moral finale. It was a diplomatic settlement shaped by leverage, exhaustion, and competing national interests. Zooming out from generals and treaties, the revolution is also defined by high-stakes choices made under severe constraints. Enslaved people understood the war might disrupt slavery, but they also understood that neither side was uniformly committed to their freedom. Many pursued liberty through flight, negotiation, and military service. Some sought freedom with the British, especially after proclamations promised liberty to those who left patriot enslavers and supported the crown. Others served with patriots, sometimes hoping for manumission, and sometimes because local conditions left few alternatives. Their choices exposed the revolution's limits. A war for liberty took place inside a slave society, producing uneven outcomes, freeing some individuals while leaving the institution largely intact. Native peoples faced a different but equally consequential dilemma. For many native nations, the revolution was less about parliament versus colonial assemblies than about land and survival. Colonial settlement had pushed west for decades, and British officials sometimes, though inconsistently and not purely out of kindness, talked about limiting expansion beyond certain lines. When colonists attacked native communities or pressed into Western territory, many native nations leaned toward the British, who seemed more likely, at least short-term, to restrain colonial land hunger. But no option was safe. Britain might trade away indigenous interests, while an American victory risked creating a republic whose settlers were already moving on to native land. These were strategic decisions under pressure, and they show why the revolution can't be reduced to freedom versus tyranny. It reshuffled power in North America, often at indigenous expense. Holding these threads together, gradual independence, persuasive ideas, universal language paired with specific grievances, years of hardship, a turning point that unlocked diplomacy, a treaty that sealed recognition, and the constrained choices of enslaved and native peoples reveals the revolution as a process, not a single event. It was a contest over legitimacy fought through pamphlets and declarations as much as muskets, and it succeeded because patriots gradually proved they could function like a nation, enduring, fighting strategically, and gaining recognition and support abroad. Bridge to Next Lesson Independence didn't solve the problems the revolution revealed. In some ways it sharpened them, because the former colonies could no longer blame an empire for every conflict. If legitimacy comes from the people, Americans now had to decide what the people meant in practice. Who counts as a full political participant? How much influence should ordinary voters have? How strong should a central government be? And how do you make it effective without recreating the kind of tyranny the revolution rejected? The pressure points were already visible. The war produced enormous debt, and debt forces choices that are never only economic. It raises moral and political questions about taxes, representation, and whose sacrifices will be honored. Revolutionary promises also collided with slavery, still embedded in law, labor, and wealth, especially in the South. Even where individuals gained freedom, The nation still had to decide whether its founding claims would widen or narrow over time. And Western expansion didn't pause when Britain left. If anything, British removal made the continent seem more open to settlement, even though native nations remained, with their own sovereignty and determination to defend it. The next phase, then, isn't a victory lap. It's a test. A society that justified independence through natural rights and popular sovereignty now has to build institutions that reflect those ideas while managing debt, disagreement, and the temptation to solve problems through force. The Revolution taught Americans how to resist a government they judged illegitimate. The question ahead is harder. What does it mean to create legitimacy from scratch and live with the consequences when lofty principles meet the realities of power?